Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Thinking Historically About. Today, we are going to be thinking historically about Chinese Americans in Southern California and honing in on the particular place of Chinatown in Los Angeles. I'm very excited to have as our guest today Eugene Moy, who is the president of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. And excited to engage in this conversation with you, Eugene. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be a part of the Chinese Historical Society? What drew you to this historical kind of bent in public service and some of the broader aims of the society itself?
I am a native of Southern California. I was born in LA, in Chinatown, uh, and 76 years ago. And I'm still learning more about myself and my community, my peers, my environment. And one thing I've learned in being involved with community is that I'm not unique or special or isolated. I am really
Mm,
part of this very large patchwork of people of different backgrounds. Uh, while there is a perception of Chinatown as being a special ethnic community, one of the things that I and we have learned is that we're really part of this larger panorama where things are constantly changing, and we can share some of the historic changes that have occurred, but there's no fixed identity uh, that we can say, well, this is what Chinese uh, Americans or Chinatown is about. Uh, I'll share a little bit of that as we go along here. So I grew up in actually, even though I was born in Chinatown, I grew up in South LA. My
mm,
dad had a grocery store at 105th and Main Streets, which is
hmm
kind of close to the Watts area. Many Chinese Americans in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s actually ran mom and pop grocery stores, or maybe ran laundries, or had small business operations in various parts of LA. And we lived in a little house behind our grocery store. That kind of experience is something that shaped, of course, my own personal identity, but I also like to share how the place of Chinese Americans kind of evolved from one generation to the next, whether you were just simply blue collar workers working in a gold mine, or working on a railroad, or working on a farm or ranch, to a business entrepreneur, to working in the aerospace industry, or then becoming elected leaders in government. Uh, so one of the reasons I got involved was to get a better understanding of my personal history, my past. Where
Yeah.
did we come from, and why are we sometimes perceived as different? Having an understanding of that historical path that our Chinese American community has taken really helps us to better uh, articulate and to talk about how we are really a part of this uh, very large uh, social and political environment.
Well, yeah, one thing that you said kind of early on is that you had came to this realization that there wasn't really this fixed identity of Chinatown. Then you also talked a little bit about the evolution of Chinese Americans in Southern California. I'm wondering, and you can make this as narrow as Chinatown and as broad as Chinese Americans, but what has that evolution looked like over the years? Like, how has Chinatown and the role of Chinese Americans in society changed over the years? And we can go as far back as you'd like here.
Well, and I'll try to keep it simple, but oftentimes many perceive of Chinese and Chinese Americans as being new immigrants, when in reality, the migration of Chinese across the Pacific and across the other oceans too, as well, began many centuries ago, beginning with early explorations out of China and into other parts of the world. And then subsequently, when European explorers sort of, quote, discovered the path to China and the Indies in order to find a quicker or faster way of importing desirable items like spices or
Mm-hmm.
tea or silk out of Asia, out of China. So from, let's say, the 14 or 1500s, Chinese have been migrating around the world, but especially to America. We know that Chinese were in Mexico and Central America and South America in larger numbers before they came to North America. When LA was founded in 1781 by a group of overland travelers from Mexico, among that uh, crew, that migrant crew, was somebody identified as a Chino. So he didn't
Mm-hmm.
actually make it to LA because his daughter got sick in Tijuana, but he eventually came into LA. In 1781, that group of settlers, 44 people, include two people identified as Espanol, two people identified as Negro, and everybody else, the families and children, were a mixture, mestizo, mulatto. So the beginning of LA was always very multi-ethnic and multicultural. Eventually, Chinese settled in Los Angeles. So when the U.S. took over California
Mm-hmm.
and in the 1850 national census, two Chinese were identified in the LA census. But there are probably others who were out in the hinterland who didn't get
Sure.
counted, uh, as usually happens. So, and even before that, though, we know that in 1795, a guy was baptized at Carmel Mission uh, up, up north. In 1815, another Chinese guy got baptized at Carmel. So we know that people were always around.
Yeah.
Eventually, what happened though, as more Chinese, whether they came from Mexico or whether they came from directly overseas, oftentimes tended to cluster because you want to be near neighbors who were like you, whether you were Irish or New Englanders or Mexican. People would live in close proximity to each other.
Yeah.
So a Chinese settlement emerged in LA by the 1850s and 1860s. It started getting called Chinatown by the 1870s, by the late 1860s and by early 1870s. So from that point on, there was this very distinct perception of a neighborhood that contained people who were not from the West, but rather they looked different and spoke a different language and had different food customs, but yet many were very deeply integrated and involved in the community. For example, one of the major roles for early Chinese in the 1870s and 1880s was working in farming or working in the food supply chain, distribution of produce and seafood and other products, and then actually working as cooks and people who served food. Uh, Many actually lived not in Chinatown, but many lived in households, private households. So a wealthy family that could afford it would hire a Chinese cook. You know, we have the perception, of course, for example, in the South, that a plantation family would would have an African American household helper,
Right.
whether it's a butler or a cook. Well, the same thing applied to Chinese workers in households. So in 1870, LA census showed about 170 in LA City and about 230 Chinese in LA County. Most of the people actually did not live, more than half of the people did not live in Chinatown, but they lived out on some ranch, Anaheim, or on a ranch in Whittier, or on a ranch in Roland, what is now Roland Heights. People were scattered. So people were actually sometimes the perception is that Chinese were forced to live in ghettos and were not allowed to live outside of Chinatown. But that's not necessarily, not really an accurate description of what was happening. Many people lived together simply because there was a rooming house or a hotel in Chinatown, and it was natural for somebody who came into town to just stay there until they found employment elsewhere. So the early Chinatowns oftentimes were landing places, were ports of entry where a person could stay until they moved up the economic or social chain and were then able to find better housing or a better place to live or a better job elsewhere. So Chinatown served a very important function as I said, a port of entry, as a place where one could transition from their immigrant beginnings when they didn't have much, where they ultimately could find a better situation for themselves.
So this, I don't know, port of entry or kind of meeting point of Chinatown, I'm sure meant a lot to Chinese and Chinese Americans who are, looking to find their community. Even if it's checkpoint, right? If you're living on a ranch somewhere else and there's a community that you can go to or know, I'm sure that brings some sense of comfort. I'm curious, what is there? What is in Chinatown that notes this? That what are the landmarks that are worth drawing attention to, either that no longer exist or continue to exist? And why are those historically significant to Chinese American history?
That's a good question, and something that we continually ask ourselves. What
Mm,
is it that identifies a Chinatown? What are the characteristics that create a sense of place? One thing, of course, is that there are these language and cultural and ethnic or food traditions that people bring with them. And by the way, this applies to not only the Chinese community, but to other communities.
absolutely. Yeah.
We had Mexican neighborhoods, we had French neighborhoods, we've had Croatian neighborhoods in LA, and for the Chinese, it was really no different. I think what really maybe made it stand out a little bit more was because it didn't use because the language didn't use the Roman alphabet,
Hmm.
because it
Hmm.
didn't, maybe because the foodways were quite different from what Western and European traditions involved. I'll talk a little bit later about how that has changed. But for generations, though, a lot of the early Chinese really made it a point to identify themselves as actually being Chinese. Confucian tradition. Confucius was a thought leader a couple of thousand years ago in China, who really set forth some guidelines or rules for daily life. And part of it was to respect your ancestors, respect your peers, respect your community. And when many migrants came over here, they set up institutions that revolved around that tradition. So if you are a member of the Lee family, and you and your cousin and your brother and other members, other people from the Lee family region in China came over, you would set up a little club or an organization, a social
Mm,
structure, and you would support each other because you were following Confucian tradition of respecting your community and your family.
yeah.
And the formation of these family associations, the family, the Wong family, the Chan family, these institutions are really what have visibly defined our Chinatowns. Seeing the family halls, the association halls, and it was through this social network that a lot of Chinatown traditions really evolved. Uh, they would be in charge of festivals like New Year events or Moon Festival, or actually part of Confucian tradition is support the building of cemeteries for those who have passed, so,
Hmm.
so that you can pay respect to your ancestors.
Yeah.
So in LA, there's a Chinese cemetery. In San Francisco, there are multiple Chinese cemeteries, and you travel worldwide, whether it's in Victoria, Canada, or Melbourne, Australia, you're going to find a Chinese cemetery. And it is setting up these kinds of institutions, the family associations, the cemeteries, and then also houses of worship. Many of the associations have created their own shrines or temples. Those architecturally help define many of our Chinatowns.
Yeah.
Go in, it's not only the businesses with their signs and say, well, this is a laundry or this is a grocery store or a restaurant, but also the like in many of our communities, what are the most distinct landmarks in your community? It's the churches,
Almost
or
always. Yeah.
yeah, that with their monumental buildings and structures that really help define the culture that supported them. So in Chinatowns, we have, you have the business side, of course, you have the residential side, but then you have also these institutions, the family associations, and the temples and churches. So
Are
that,
there any particular ones that are worth noting in Chinatown? Maybe students will walk past, or that you can provide some context for.
well, in LA, we have several that we actually regularly share. In the 19th century, while many temples and shrines were started by the early 20th century because of Chinese exclusion, and we can talk more about that later, but because of exclusion and anti-Chinese sentiment, many of a lot of the population was lost, first of all, but then
Mm,
those who were here tended to avoid being too public in promoting their culture, but instead, there was definitely an effort to try and integrate and to assimilate and to merge into this larger environment so as to be accepted.
yeah.
So in the early 20th century, we saw many of these temples disappear, and we saw the emergence of Christian churches,
Hmm.
Chinese Christian churches, whether it's Catholic or Baptist or Methodist or Presbyterian. So those institutions actually evolved and remain today. So in Chinatown, we have the largest of the Christian churches, the First Chinese Baptist Church, where my parents were actually both baptized. But we have a Methodist church. Presbyterian church has moved to the suburbs. Catholic Church is still in Chinatown. With more recent immigration from Southeast Asia and China and Taiwan, and we've actually seen the emergence or the re-emergence, the traditional Chinese temples and shrines. So the largest of the places that one can visit, if I were a student, probably the one of the most fascinating would be the Tenhao Temple, the goddess of heaven, the goddess of the seas. But there are many people who follow Tenhao or Matsu, depending on which location you're from. But there are several Tenhao temples in the Los Angeles area now. But in Chinatown itself, we have a pretty good sized $1 million or multi-million-dollar temple that uh, opened about 20 years ago.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
and
Which is very recent considering the longevity of Chinese Americans here.
right, but it reflects the influence and
Yeah.
the participation by Vietnamese and Cambodian
Okay.
Chinese
Uh-huh.
Americans. So it actually sits on the site of a former Mandarin Baptist church. And
Okay.
before that, it was an Italian Baptist church.
Oh, how funny.
So I'm sharing that because it reflects how our communities evolve.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They're very organic and constantly changing. Before what we now call Chinatown, which is not all that large of an area, it's a half mile by half mile.
Yeah.
But before that, we had before old Chinatown was torn down to make way for Union Station. This neighborhood that we're in right now on Broadway and Hill Streets as the major streets, it was really a largely, but almost majority Italian neighborhood. And before that, it was largely a Mexican or Mexican American. It was called
Yeah.
Sonora Town in
Hmm.
the 19th century. So we've had this evolving cultural change as it's been occurring. So you asked about other institutions. We have our churches and temples. Oh, by the
Yeah.
way, and the some of the landmarks from the earlier era are still very active. While I mentioned the first Chinese Baptist church as the most active of the Chinese Christian churches, another institution that's pretty active is St. Peter's Italian Catholic Church on Broadway,
Okay. Uh-huh.
and the Italian Cultural Center, which is part of the property. Broadway was known as the spine of Little Italy.
Oh, wow.
In the early 20th century, this was the center of the Italian community. Up on the hillside in the what is now the Chinatown residential area, there's the St. Anthony's Croatian Catholic Church, and that still serves the Croatian community of Southern California. So this neighborhood, while many might have settled or landed here originally from Croatia, again, the port of entry location that we have here, that has been the kind of a stepping stone for many. They might have moved to the suburbs, but they still come to this central location.
Yeah.
The Croatians, the Italians, as well as the Chinese and the Vietnamese. There's a special place for this neighborhood in the hearts and minds of a lot of people. This is where we first came when our family arrived here. Castellar School, which is the second oldest elementary school in the LA Unified System, uh, was built in 1882 or started in 1882. It has a new building now, but it started in 1882, and a few years ago, in 1982, we helped celebrate its 100th anniversary,
Hmm.
and we sought to that we, meaning the Chinese Historical Society, uh, made a call for the oldest, earliest graduates of Castellar School. Those who came, the earliest graduates, were all of Italian background
Oh, wow.
because
Uh-huh.
because in, let's say, the 1915s and 1920s, the largest demographic in this area was Italian.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So we see neighborhoods change, and we do ask, what is Chinatown? Or are we going to be all Chinese in the coming decades.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, Chinatown is maybe 20 to 25% Latino.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the demographic of LA.
Yep.
There's definitely uh, a need for places to live. By the city of LA itself might be what 40% Latino.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a surprise.
In kind of your engagement with the public, and it could be, schools and students, but it could also be just the public at large. Are there particular things that you've seen as themes in kind of a lack of knowledge about Chinatown and Chinese American history? And, with that, like what are things that you hope more people know about this history?
One of the challenges of growing up being Chinese American or Asian American goes back to what I was mentioning earlier. You know, you have a different appearance than what many might perceive to be as what might one conceive of as being American. So we are constantly needing to prove ourselves as being 100% American.
Mm-hmm.
This ongoing perception that somehow we are foreigners who just came here only recently, and we speak a different language, eat a different food, worship at different places, and this is all alien or new. We're not necessarily treated as full-fledged citizens. But as I mentioned earlier, Chinese have been in America for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah.
The earliest Chinese were in the Americas before the Mayflower arrived.
Mm-hmm.
There were Chinese who were in the U.S. at the time of the signing of the Constitution.
Yeah.
There were Chinese who actually fought in the American Civil War. That's not well known. Chinese have been involved in all strata of society, you know, not just working as cooks and butlers, but also working as business people and intermarrying. There are many people who might have Chinese blood and not know it, or
Mm.
maybe it's not a big part of their identity.
Yeah.
But yet, the DNA that we all have is spread across the continent.
Yeah, it makes me reflect on, needing to have a real, I guess, introspective moment and ask, well, what does it mean to be American, right?
Right.
And this is something where we maybe don't want to ask all the time as a society.
One of the things that we encourage young people to do is to ask questions of their parents, their grandparents, their relatives. Where did you come from? Where have you lived? What kind of work have you done? And that creates a kind of a backdrop for the relationships with other communities, other people. We all have mixed DNA.
Yeah.
There's no pure one race or another. That's one of the fallacies that sometimes
Mhm.
you hear of, is that so when there's a push to be American, you always have to ask, well, what does that mean?
Right.
It's not it should not be about race and
Yeah.
ethnicity. It's really more about our political and legal principles that we have followed,
Yeah.
whether it's the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and yet there's some questioning right now of certain elements of the Constitution,
Mm.
like birthright citizenship, the
Yeah.
14th Amendment. Does a person who was born here, can they call themselves American? Are they American citizens? Founding fathers certainly had a sense of the way it should be, but now there's some who are thinking that it's not appropriate. Are certain current battles on immigration. When you look at our landscape around us, in all of our communities, we've been we were created through immigration.
There's no other way.
Yeah, right. And right now, you can see that in many countries or communities as well as countries, because of declining birth rates, the lack of both skilled and unskilled labor and intellectual capacity. Some countries are they see the brain drain, either brain drain or the need for labor to keep the machinery of
Hmm.
life going. Countries like Japan or China and this country need to have immigrant labor to
Yeah.
keep things functioning, whether it's producing food or actually building cars, making the stuff that we need. So to deny the entry of immigrants who want to come here and work is really counter to common sense. Really, we need
Yeah. And
people
the
for
country's success, right?
right to support our economy and our social and political development. So we've evolved, but we shouldn't be taking steps backward.
I'm going to end us here, Eugene. That was what a sentence to end on. We've evolved, but we shouldn't be taking steps backward. Eugene, thank you so much for thinking historically about Chinese American history and Chinatown with us. I wish this went on for hours. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.